I woke up from surgery at 2:14 in the afternoon, throat raw from the breathing tube, and the first thing I did, before I even asked the nurse how the operation went, was look at the door of my recovery room, because my mother had promised me for 3 weeks that she'd be standing in it when I opened my eyes. She wasn't, nobody was. I want to tell you exactly what kind of surgery this was because it matters for what comes later. I'd had severe, recurring gallbladder attacks for almost 2 years, the kind of pain that doubles you over in a grocery store aisle, that makes you cancel plans and apologize for canceling plans and eventually stop making plans at all. What was supposed to be a routine laparoscopic removal turned complicated on the table. My surgeon later told me they found extensive scar tissue from a previous, smaller flare-up nobody had caught, and what should have been a 90-minute procedure with 4 small incisions turned into a 3.5-hour open surgery with a recovery timeline closer to 6 weeks than 6 days. My mother knew all of this. I'd sent her the surgeon's own printed explanation the week before, highlighted the recovery timeline in yellow, told her I needed someone there for the first 48 hours because I live alone and the anesthesia alone can make you unsafe on your feet. She'd said, and I quote because I saved the text message, "Of course, sweetheart, I wouldn't miss it. I'll be there when you wake up." She called instead 40 minutes after I came out of recovery while a nurse was helping me sip water through a straw because swallowing anything solid still felt impossible. Her voice was clipped, apologetic in that specific way that doesn't actually sound sorry. "Marin, honey, I am so sorry, the roads up here are just a mess, there's ice everywhere, I couldn't risk the drive." I remember looking out the hospital window while she talked. It wasn't snowing in our town. It hadn't snowed in 4 days. My mother lived 40 minutes away in a town with the exact same weather system as mine, and I remember thinking, with the strange flat clarity you sometimes get right after anesthesia, that something about her voice didn't match the story she was telling. I found out 6 hours later from a photo my brother posted. If you're watching this and you've ever woken up from something hard, a surgery, a bad night, any moment where you needed someone and they weren't there, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because I think this story is going to feel familiar to more of you than you'd expect. The photo was from my brother Todd's Instagram story. Time-stamped 1:52 p.m., 22 minutes before I even opened my eyes in recovery. It showed my mother laughing, a glass of white wine in her hand, standing in Todd's kitchen next to a banner that read, "Congrats on the promotion." The caption said, "So proud of this guy." Mom couldn't wait to celebrate. The roads apparently had been fine enough to drive to my brother's house. I stared at that photo for a long time on the small hospital-issued screen of my phone, propped up against the pillow because I still couldn't fully sit up on my own. Priya had airdropped it to me the second she saw it, with a single line of text underneath. "Is this real?" I zoomed in on the timestamp 3 separate times, as if it might change if I looked at it hard enough, as if some part of me was hoping I'd misread it, and it would turn out to say something else entirely. 11:52 the night before. Maybe some innocent explanation that would put my mother safely back on the road toward me instead of standing in my brother's kitchen with a wine glass in her hand, while I was still numb from the waist up. It didn't change. I set the phone face down on the blanket and stared at the ceiling instead, listening to the soft, steady beep of the monitor beside my bed, and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still, not the loud kind of hurt, but the kind that settles in slowly and finds a permanent place to live. I didn't say anything to my mother that first night. I couldn't, I was still too sedated, still nauseous, still fighting to keep my eyes open long enough to text my best friend Priya a single line. She lied about the roads. She was at Todd's. Priya drove over that same evening once visiting hours technically ended, and the nurses, bless them, let her stay anyway because I clearly had nobody else coming. She sat in the vinyl chair beside my bed, scrolling through the same Instagram story I'd already screenshotted 4 times, and said the thing I think I needed someone else to say out loud before I could really believe it myself. "Marin, this isn't just a missed visit, look at the timestamp. She was already there, already celebrating before you were even out of surgery. That's not a last-minute change of plans. That's a plan she made before you ever went under." I didn't want to believe that. I think some part of you never fully wants to believe your own mother chose somewhere else to be while you were being cut open on an operating table. But Priya was right about the math, and math doesn't care what you want to believe. The next morning, groggy but more coherent, I called my mother. I didn't accuse her of anything yet, I just asked carefully how the roads had cleared up so fast. There was a pause just a beat too long. What do you mean? I saw Todd's post, Mom. You were at his promotion party yesterday at 2 o'clock. Another pause, longer this time. Then, instead of an apology, I got the first version of an explanation that would shift shape at least 3 more times over the following weeks. It was already planned, Marin. Todd's been working toward that promotion for 8 months. I couldn't just cancel on him at the last minute. You know how sensitive he's been since the divorce. I had major surgery, Mom. You told me you'd be there when I woke up. You had a surgeon and nurses right there, sweetheart. You were in good hands. Todd needed his mother there for something that mattered to him. I remember staring at the ceiling tile above my hospital bed. There was a small brown water stain shaped almost like a comma, and thinking that I had never, in 34 years, heard my mother describe anything happening to me as something that mattered. Not the way she described things happening to Todd. I didn't argue further that day. I hung up and I let the hurt settle into something quieter and more useful, the way I'd eventually learned to do with everything else that year. I started paying closer attention. Here's where it gets more complicated, and where the first real piece of documented evidence enters the story, not because I went looking for it, but because a coworker mentioned something to me in the break room 3 weeks after I went back to work, still moving carefully, still wearing looser clothes over the incision site. How's the recovery fund going? She asked. I saw the page your mom set up. I donated $40. I had no idea what she was talking about. I went home that night and searched my own name on a fundraising platform I'd never heard of before, something called Help Fund, and there it was. A page titled Help Marin Heal Emergency Surgery Recovery Fund. Created by my mother, using a photo of me from a family barbecue 2 summers earlier, describing my surgery in emotional, slightly exaggerated language, unexpected complications, financial strain from missed work. Every dollar helps my daughter get back on her feet. The page had raised $6,240 from 61 donors. Friends of mine, coworkers, a former college roommate I hadn't spoken to in years who'd apparently seen the page shared on Facebook by my aunt. People who loved me, reaching into their own pockets because they believed I needed help. I had never seen a cent of it. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, scrolling through the donor comments, kind, generous, worried messages, people wishing me a fast recovery, and felt something twist in my chest that was different from the hurt of the hospital room. This wasn't neglect anymore. This was someone using my surgery, my pain, my name, to raise money that had gone somewhere I hadn't approved and couldn't see. I scrolled slowly through every comment, reading each one twice, and somewhere around the 40th message my eyes landed on one from a woman named Carol, a former neighbor from the house I grew up in, someone I hadn't spoken to in almost a decade. Marin, I'm so sorry you're going through this. Your mom mentioned you were struggling to make rent while you recovered, sending love and this small contribution. Struggling to make rent. I own my apartment outright, had for 3 years, a fact my mother knew perfectly well because she'd helped me move boxes into it. I read that comment 4 times, feeling something cold settle into my stomach, because it meant this wasn't just money redirected after the fact. The story itself had been built, detail by invented detail, specifically to make people feel the kind of urgency that opens wallets. I called my mother again. This time I didn't ease into it. There's a fundraiser with my name on it. $6,000, I never saw any of it. Where did it go? The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I actually checked to see if the call had dropped. It's Marin, it's complicated, she finally said. I was going to explain everything once things settled down. Explain it now. What my mother told me that day was only the first layer, though I didn't know that yet. She said the fundraiser money had gone toward family expenses during a hard stretch, that she'd meant to set some aside for me, but things had gotten complicated with Todd's situation, and that she'd tell me everything once she had more clarity. I pushed. I'd learned, over the previous 3 weeks, that vague explanations from my mother were never accidents. They were carefully unfinished on purpose, designed to give her room to adjust the story later depending on what I already knew. So I asked directly, what situation with Todd? He's been having some financial trouble, she admitted, since the divorce. He fell behind on some payments, and there were people, collectors I guess is the word, calling him, and it was getting stressful, and I just wanted to help him get current before it became a bigger problem. with money people raised for my surgery. I was going to pay it back once Todd got back on his feet. It wasn't supposed to be permanent, Marin. I never meant for you to find out this way. I was protecting you from having to worry about it. That word again, protecting. I'd started to notice by that point that in my family, protecting almost always meant deciding for someone else without asking them, in a way that happened to benefit whoever was doing the deciding. I didn't say much else on that call. I hung up and sat with it for a few days because I wanted to be careful. I didn't want to blow up a relationship with my mother over a misunderstanding if there was still a version of this that made sense. So I did something I probably should have done from the beginning. I logged back into the Help Fund page, this time not as a stranger seeing it for the first time, but as the actual subject of it, and requested the platform's donor and withdrawal history. A feature, it turned out, that any named beneficiary or their legal representative could request, since Help Fund had policies specifically designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. It took the platform's trust and safety team 11 days to respond. What they sent me changed the shape of the entire story. The document Help Fund sent was a simple spreadsheet, but I read it more times than any spreadsheet has ever deserved to be read. Every donation was listed with a timestamp, a donor name where public, and critically, every withdrawal my mother had made from the account, with the date, the amount, and the linked bank account the money had been transferred to. There were 4 withdrawals over 6 weeks: $1,800, $2,200, $1,640, $600. All 4 transferred to the same account listed under the name T. Ellery, my brother. Not family expenses, vaguely defined. Not a shared account, not an emergency I'd never been told about. Every single dollar, 100% of the $6,240 raised in my name, for my surgery, from people who thought they were helping me, every dollar had gone directly to Todd. I printed the spreadsheet, which felt like an old-fashioned instinct in a world where everything lives on a screen, but I wanted to hold it, to see the numbers lined up in black and white where I could underline them, circle the dates, lay them next to the calendar on my kitchen wall where I'd marked my own surgery date in blue pen months earlier. The first withdrawal, $1,800, had been made 9 days after my surgery, while I was still barely walking to my own mailbox without wincing. The last one, $600, had gone through the same week I'd finally been cleared to return to work part-time. My entire recovery mapped out in someone else's transactions. I called Priya before I called anyone else because I needed to say it out loud to someone who'd believe me without needing convincing. It's all documented, I told her, every transfer. My name, my surgery, my face on the fundraiser page, and every dollar went to him. Are you going to confront her with it? I thought about that for a long time before I answered. I want to understand why first. Not because it changes what she did, but because I think if I don't understand it, I'm going to spend years wondering. So I called Todd instead. My brother didn't deny it, which surprised me, though in hindsight it probably shouldn't have. Todd has always been more transparent than our mother in a strange, almost disarming way. He's never been good at hiding things. He's just never had to, because she'd always covered for him before anyone else noticed. I didn't know it was your surgery money specifically, he said, though something in his tone made it hard to believe he'd asked many questions before accepting it. Mom just said she had some funds set aside and could help me get current on a few things. I was drowning, Marin. I had 2 collections agencies calling my job. I was scared I was going to lose the promotion I'd been working toward for a year because you can't get security clearance for the position with active collections on your credit, and I panicked, and I asked Mom for help, and she said she had it handled. Handled, I repeated. With money that had my name on it, raised because I couldn't work while I was recovering from major surgery. There was a long pause. I'm sorry, he said finally, and I believed that part was probably true, at least in the moment he said it. I should have asked more questions about where it was coming from. I think some part of me didn't want to know because I needed the help too badly to look too closely. I've thought about that sentence a lot since. I think it's one of the most honest things anyone said to me during the entire year this story covers, the idea that sometimes people don't ask questions not because they're cruel, but because the answer might cost them something they desperately need. It doesn't excuse what happened, but it helped me understand that Todd wasn't a mastermind here. He was, in his own way, another person my mother had decided to manage rather than tell the truth to. The real architect of the decision, the one who'd started the fundraiser, chosen the words, made the withdrawals, and then told me a version of events designed to keep me from asking too many follow-up questions, was our mother. And I still didn't fully understand why, until I found the second piece of evidence, almost by accident, 4 months later. I want to tell you about the text message thread, because it's the part of this story that still makes my stomach turn every time I think about it, even now. My mother has never been particularly careful with technology. She still, to this day, occasionally sends texts meant for one person to an entire group thread by mistake, usually followed by a flustered "sorry, wrong chat." A few minutes later, 4 months after the fundraiser discovery, in the middle of an unrelated family group text about Thanksgiving plans, she made exactly that mistake. Except this time, the message that landed in the group thread wasn't meant for anyone in it. It was meant for Todd, sent to the wrong conversation entirely, still visible to me, my aunt, and my cousin for the 11 minutes it took her to notice and delete it. I'd already taken a screenshot by the time it disappeared. The message read, "Don't mention the fund to Marin if it comes up." I told her it was family expenses. She doesn't need the specifics. She's always been the more sensitive one about money stuff, easier to just handle it quietly and let her think what she wants. I read it standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd found the fundraiser page months earlier, and felt something settle into place that I'd been circling around for a while without quite landing on. This wasn't a mother who'd made a rushed, panicked decision in a moment of crisis and regretted it. This was someone actively managing what I was allowed to know weeks and months after the fact, still deciding, long after the money was already spent, what version of the truth I deserved. The more sensitive one about money stuff. I'd never once in my adult life made a scene about money. I'd simply asked a direct question and expected a direct answer. Somewhere along the way, my mother had rewritten that into a character flaw she could use to justify keeping me in the dark. I didn't confront her immediately. I sat with the screenshot for almost a week, partly because I needed to be sure I wasn't reading too much into it, and partly because some quiet, stubborn part of me was still hoping there was an explanation that made this smaller than it looked. There wasn't. I eventually showed it to Priya, and then, because I wanted a second, less emotionally involved opinion, I showed it to my cousin Alina, who'd been in the group thread when it happened and had her own screenshot independently, unprompted, sitting in her phone. "I saw that and didn't know what to say," Alina admitted. "I almost texted you about it myself." I asked my mother to meet me for coffee, the same way I'd once seen other people handle difficult family conversations, because some instinct told me a public, neutral space would keep things calmer than her kitchen or mine. I brought the screenshot. I brought the withdrawal spreadsheet. I laid them both on the table between us before she'd even finished stirring sugar into her coffee. She looked at them for a long moment, and I watched something in her posture change, not collapse exactly, more like a shift from one prepared script to another, the way you'd flip to a different page in a binder you'd already tabbed in advance. "I don't understand why this has become such a crisis," she said finally. "Todd needed help. I helped him. You recovered fine either way, you had insurance, you had savings, you were never actually going to be in real financial trouble. Todd could have lost his job. I could have lost a lot of things too, Mom. I was alone for the first 48 hours after major surgery because you chose to be somewhere else. And then you let 61 people believe their money was helping me when it never was. I never lied to those people. I said it was for family medical expenses. It was a family expense. It just wasn't the specific expense they assumed." I sat back, genuinely stunned by how comfortably she said it, how thoroughly she seemed to believe her own careful phrasing made this something other than what it obviously was. "You wrote that I had financial strain from missed work," I said. "You used my face, my surgery, my name. And then you told my own brother not to mention it to me, and when I asked you directly, you called it complicated instead of just telling me the truth." "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this," she said, and for the first time, something like real frustration cracked through her composure. "You've never understood what it's like to have 2 children and only enough of yourself to go around. Todd needed me in a way that felt urgent. You've always been able to handle things on your own, you're strong, Marin, you always have been, and I think somewhere along the way I started assuming strong meant you didn't need me the same way he does." It was, I think, the closest thing to an honest sentence she said that entire year. It didn't make what she'd done acceptable. But it gave me, for the first time, something that looked less like malice and more like a decades-old habit of comparison. One child cast as capable, the other as fragile, and every resource in the family quietly redirected according to that story, whether or not it was still true. I told her I needed time. I didn't yell. I didn't storm out. I just paid for both coffees, which felt oddly important in the moment, and left. I want to be honest about what taking time actually looked like because I think it's the part of stories like this that gets skipped over most often. I didn't file a police report. I thought about it, technically, using fundraiser money for a purpose other than the one publicly stated could constitute fraud, especially given the deliberate language in her messages showing she knew she was concealing it. I spoke to a lawyer friend of Priya's about it once, hypothetically, over dinner, and she confirmed that donors could, in theory, pursue a claim against my mother for misrepresentation, since they'd given money believing it was going to a specific stated purpose. But I didn't want a courtroom. I wanted something smaller and, honestly, harder. I wanted the donors to know the truth, because I couldn't stand the idea of 61 people believing they'd helped me when they hadn't, while my mother quietly let that misunderstanding stand indefinitely. So I did the one thing that felt right to me. I posted an update on the Help Fund page myself, using my legal right as the named beneficiary to add a beneficiary statement, something the platform's policy specifically allowed for exactly this kind of situation. I kept it factual and calm, no accusations, just the truth. That I hadn't received any of the funds raised, that they'd been used for an unrelated family expense without my knowledge, and that I was personally repaying every donor who wanted their contribution returned, out of my own savings, over the following several months. It cost me almost $4,000 I didn't have to spare, spread out over 8 months of smaller payments. Every donor who accepted the repayment got a personal message from me, not an accusation against my mother, just an honest thank you and an apology that their generosity had been misdirected. Most people were kind about it. A few were angry, understandably, and I let them be angry because they deserved to be. Carol, the old neighbor who'd donated because she'd been told I was struggling to make rent, wrote back a message that stuck with me longer than most. I'm not upset about the money, honey. I'm upset that someone I trusted used your name to lie to me. Please don't ever hesitate to actually ask me for help if you need it. That's what neighbors are for. I sat with that message for a long time because it captured something I hadn't quite been able to articulate myself. The damage wasn't only financial. It was the quiet erosion of trust between me and people who cared about me, built on a foundation my mother had constructed without my knowledge or consent. My mother found out about the update within days. Several of the donors were mutual family friends, and word travels fast in small towns. She called me, furious in a way I'd rarely heard from her before. You humiliated me, she said. In front of people I have to see at church, Marin. Was that the point? To embarrass me? The point, I said, was that people gave money to help me and they deserved to know the truth about where it went. That's not about you, that's about them. She hung up on me. We didn't speak again for almost 5 months. 5 months is a long time to not speak to your mother, especially when you're the kind of person who used to call her every Sunday out of habit more than anything else. I won't pretend those months were easy. There were nights I drafted long, careful texts trying to explain my side one more time, in case this new phrasing might finally be the one that landed, and deleted every one of them before sending, because some part of me already understood that the problem was never a lack of clear explanation. She'd understood exactly what she'd done. She simply hadn't expected consequences for it. Todd, to his credit, reached out during that stretch more than he ever had before. He'd started paying his own collections down slowly, on a payment plan without our mother's help, and I think some part of him was quietly trying to prove, to himself as much as to me, that he could stand on his own when he had to. We didn't talk about the fundraiser much. We talked about ordinary things, work, a show we were both watching, small normal conversations that felt like the first real rebuilding of something between us that had nothing to do with our mother managing either of us. I finished repaying the last donor in March, almost a full year after my surgery. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, that same table, finalizing the last transfer and feeling something I hadn't expected. Not triumph, not even relief exactly, just a kind of quiet completion. The sense of having closed a door properly instead of just walking away and leaving it hanging open. 2 weeks later, my mother called me for the first time in 5 months. She wasn't calling to apologize. "I need to tell you something," she said, and her voice had a quality I recognized immediately because I'd heard it in my own voice the year before in that hospital bed, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "I had some testing done. They found gallstones, the doctors talking about surgery the same kind you had. He said mine might be complicated too, because of scar tissue from an old procedure years ago that nobody ever really dealt with properly." I sat very still on my couch, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something strange move through me, not satisfaction, though I want to be honest that some small, ungenerous part of me did register the irony immediately. Mostly what I felt was a kind of vertigo, like the ground under an old argument had just shifted without warning. "When's the surgery?" I asked. 3 weeks. "I'm scared, Marin." Her voice cracked slightly on my name, and I don't think it was performance, not this time. I don't really have anyone lined up to be there. Todd offered, but he's got the new position now, he can't easily take time off, and She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. We both understood exactly what she was asking, and exactly why it was so hard for her to ask it directly, given everything that had happened the last time one of us needed the other to show up. "What does the doctor say the recovery will look like?" I asked, mostly to give myself a second to think, because my mind had gone strangely blank the moment I understood what she was really asking me. 6 weeks, he said. "Maybe longer if it's as complicated as they think." He mentioned scar tissue, same as they told you. "I keep thinking about how much pain you must have been in, and I never let myself think about what it actually felt like for you physically that day. I think I was so focused on Todd's thing that I just didn't let it be real to me." I told her I needed to think about it. I hung up the phone and sat in my quiet apartment for a long time, turning the question over from every angle I could find. This wasn't really about the surgery. It was about whether I was capable of being a different kind of person than she'd been, whether showing up for someone who hadn't shown up for me made me generous, or just made me someone who'd learned nothing from the last 2 years. I called Priya, I called Todd. I even, at one strange low point around midnight, made a pros and cons list on a legal pad like I was deciding on a job offer instead of whether to sit in a waiting room for my own mother. In the end, I decided to go, not because she deserved it and not because I'd forgotten what happened, but because I realized I didn't want to become someone who measured every act of kindness against a ledger of what I'd been owed. I wanted the choice to be mine, made freely, not a debt collected or a debt repaid. I sat in the surgical waiting room at Cedar Grove Medical Center for 3 hours and 40 minutes, the same waiting room, I realized partway through, where Todd had apparently sat exactly 1 year earlier for exactly no time at all, because he hadn't come either, a detail I only learned that day almost by accident. From a nurse who remembered my mother from her pre-op consultation and mentioned, kindly, "It's nice she has someone with her this time." This time. I didn't say anything to correct her, but I sat with that phrase for the rest of the afternoon. This time, as if the previous time had simply been unremarkable rather than a choice someone made. When my mother woke up in recovery, groggy, uncomfortable, the same raw-throated confusion I remembered from my own surgery a year earlier, I was the first face she saw. She reached for my hand before she'd even fully focused her eyes, and started crying in that thin, disoriented way people cry right after anesthesia, when the emotional walls that usually hold everything together haven't quite rebuilt themselves yet. "You came," she said. "I said I would." "I didn't," she said, and I understood even through the fog of the anesthesia that she wasn't asking a question. She was finally, for the first time in over a year, simply stating the fact out loud without a softened explanation trailing behind it. "No," I agreed, "you didn't." We sat with that for a while, neither of us saying anything else. It wasn't an apology, not fully. She never gave me the kind of clean, complete apology I used to imagine I needed. But something about her saying it plainly, without immediately reaching for a justification, felt like more honesty than I'd gotten from her in the entire year before. I'd like to tell you that this was the moment everything got repaired, that my mother became a different person after her own surgery gave her a taste of what she'd put me through. That's not quite true, and I think it's important to say so, because I know some of you watching this are hoping for exactly that kind of ending, and I don't want to give you a version of my life that isn't real. My mother did apologize eventually more directly about 6 weeks after her surgery, once she was steadier on her feet and had had time to sit with everything. It wasn't perfect. She still, even in that conversation, reached for some of the old language. I know I handled it wrong, but you have to understand the position I was in with Todd. But underneath it, for the first time, there was also a version of accountability I hadn't heard from her before. I should have told you the truth from the beginning instead of deciding you couldn't handle it. That wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't really about you at all. It was about me not knowing how to say no to Todd, and finding it easier to take from you instead because I knew you'd forgive me eventually. I don't know if I've fully forgiven her, if I'm honest. I've forgiven enough to sit in that waiting room, to hold her hand in recovery, to have dinner with her now every few weeks instead of every few months. I haven't forgiven enough to fully trust her with money, or with the quiet assumption that she'll always choose fairly between her children without someone checking the math. Maybe that's not full forgiveness. Maybe it's just a more honest kind of relationship than the one we had before, one with boundaries instead of blind trust, which looking back might be the healthier version anyway. There's a particular dinner I remember from that stretch of rebuilding, a few months after her surgery when she brought up the fundraiser herself, unprompted, for the first time since our coffee shop conversation almost 2 years earlier. I think about Carol sometimes, she said out of nowhere over a plate of pasta neither of us was really eating. The neighbor, I made up that part about the rent, you know. I don't even know why, it just felt like it would make people give more, and once I'd written it, deleting it felt harder than leaving it there. She looked down at her plate for a long moment. That's the part I think about the most, honestly, not Todd's money, the lie I made up about you out of nothing because it was convenient. I didn't say anything right away. I just let her sit with it, because I think that was the first time she'd fully let herself sit with it too. Todd and I are closer now than we've ever been, oddly enough closer, I think, because we finally started talking to each other directly instead of always going through her first. He paid me back slowly over the following year, every dollar of the $6,240, even though I told him more than once he didn't have to. He said he needed to for his own sake as much as mine. I think about that hospital window a lot, the one I stared out of while my mother told me the roads were too icy to drive, in a town with no ice at all. I think about how long it took me to stop accepting explanations that didn't quite match what I could see with my own eyes, and how much clearer everything became once I started asking for documents instead of just believing the story I was told. I don't think my mother is a villain. I think she's a woman who spent decades quietly deciding one child needed protecting and the other could handle anything, and never noticed how much weight that second assumption put on the child she thought was strong enough to carry it without complaint. I was strong enough. That was never really the question. The question was whether I should have had to be. If there's a lesson in any of this, it's not really about surgery or fundraisers or even about mothers and favorite children. It's simpler than that and harder. Sometimes the people who love us the most are also the people most practiced at deciding, quietly and without asking, what we do and don't need to know. You're allowed to ask for the receipts anyway. You're allowed to want the truth even from people who love you, especially from people who love you. This story is a work of fiction, created for entertainment and reflective purposes. Any resemblance to real individuals or events is coincidental. If it stayed with you, it's because most of us know, somewhere in our own families, a version of a story where love and honesty didn't always arrive in the same hands, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is ask for both anyway.